Morning.
Good morning. I should say good afternoon.
I guess so.
It's it's almost 1 o'clock here in Florida, and it's about 75 degrees outside.
Oh, that's wonderful. It's almost noon
It
here
is,
and
and no snow
it's
around.
maybe 10 degrees. But the sun is shining, so that helps.
It does. Yeah, one thing I could never stand is cloudy days.
Where are you in Florida?
I'm in Winter Garden, which is just outside Orlando.
Okay. So we'll get started about 8 minutes or so
That's
when
fine.
everybody gets here.
Okay.
That's James. You're muted.
Bonjour, how are you?
Bonjour. I'm good. Thank you. I am going to make you a co-host.
I'd like that. Thank you.
And then you'll be able to share your screen.
Oh, that's
And I'll kind of get us kick off things. I think Rich is going to come on and introduce you. We'll see. It kind of depended on his counseling schedule.
okay.
And then you take off and do your thing. And then I
Great.
know you need to leave about 1:50, right?
Yeah, 145, 150.
Okay.
When I booked this, it was before my son went to school.
Oh, well, listen, just let me know and then I'll
Okay.
kind of pick things up and go from there.
It's wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. Really
I'm
great.
very excited. Would you like to entertain questions as you go? Or
Fine.
do you want them to save till the end?
There's kind of two parts of it. So in the middle of it, maybe we'll take questions from the first part on the 7 generations, and then during the 7 grandfather teachings, we'll do questions at the end.
Okay, great.
So how long would you like for that? Maybe I'll stop at 11:40 and we'll take questions for about 10 minutes or.
Like 12:40?
Oh, exactly. 1:40.
Yeah. If we stop in the middle and then stop again, that should be fine. And I
Okay.
think 5-10 minutes, unless I see a whole lot of stuff in the chat, and I'll watch
Great.
the chat for you because I know it's hard to see that when you're sharing your screen.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure. Oh, and we are recording.
Great.
Okay. Let's see. Just want to welcome everyone. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes. We're expecting quite a few more people. And so I'm going to give them a few more minutes to join us, and then we'll launch into it. So glad you can all be here today. And if you could type in your name, email, and organization into the chat, that's going to help us with attendance and any follow-up information that we can send your way. We'll get going here soon. All right. Well, we still have more people coming, but I think we'll go ahead and get started. We're at a few minutes after noon. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. If Rich joins us and I can't see it, somebody let me know because I think he would like to introduce James and I don't want to miss him. Um, Today, we are really fortunate to have James Vukelich, and help me, James, pronounce this. Is it Kagegaba?
Kage Gabo. That was really good. That was
Okay, thank you. I'm working on it. Um, and we're excited to have him here with us. He's the creator of the Ojibwa Word of the Day. And I know at least my colleague, Sherry, has been visiting that for some time and really enjoys it. And we are going to have two parts to our presentation today. And we're going to take questions at the breaks in between the two parts. If you do have like a clarification or something like that, or a concern, please type it in the chat and I'll help James know what's happening there because it's hard to watch and present at the same time. I think at this point, let's make sure that Sherry has, Rich joined us. Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to James. And James, if you could do a little more as of an introduction. I mean, I could read your bio, but you're going to be much more animated and fun to hear from. And I want to turn things over to you and then let me know if I can be of any help throughout the presentation.
Igwage, thank you. I really appreciate that. And I suppose by way of introduction, Buju Indinawe Makanadok, Anin, Kage Gabo Indijnikas, Mekanak and Dudem, Mekanak Wajuing and Dunjaba, Beishoga Kapakang and Danongong, Apijigo Miigwage, Pisandawiek, Minawadash Ganawabamieg, Gijaganashim Bangi. So I'll speak a little English too. Hello, all of my relatives, is what I said. That was a traditional Ojibwe protocol greeting. I said, hello, all of my relatives. My name is Kage Gabo, he who stands eternally. I'm also James Vukelich. I'm Turtle Clan. I'm a descendant of Turtle Mountain. I live close to Minneapolis today. And I wanted to thank you all for listening and watching this 7 Generations and 7 Grandfathers teaching presentation. It's actually a lifelong ambition to speak about this topic all over the world. And whenever I have an opportunity to speak to different audiences, I feel genuine gratitude for that and appreciation. And so I always like beginning by saying thank you for listening. And today, I will be talking in this first part about something that happens internationally in Anishinaabe, in Indian country. It's a concept called 7 generations. And I don't know if you have maybe heard this. If you've worked with Indigenous communities, most likely you have heard of this concept of 7 generations. And it happens internationally here. So for example, the Lakota warrior and holy man, Hehaka Sapa, Black Elk, he spoke of a time at just after the battle at Wounded Knee, the massacre there. And he said it would take his people, the Lakota, a time span of 7 generations to make the circle, the hoop of life whole again with the Wasichu, with the Americans. So for him, this was a unit of time for healing. Another profound one that I heard as a young man comes from the Haudenosaunee speaking people, the Iroquois, who, when Deganawida, that was the name of the great peacemaker, when he brought the great laws of peace to his people, he told them that in every one of your decisions, in every one of your deliberations, you're going to have to think 7 generations into the future. And the first time I heard that, I thought that's very profound, but it was a little confounding as well. How do you do that? How do you come up with a decision, an action, a choice that's going to affect someone you're never going to see, never going to listen to hold, or speak to? How do you make a choice or decision that's going to affect someone 7 generations from now. And what I'd like to present to you today is an Anishinaabe Ojibwe Chippewa interpretation of 7 generations. So earlier when I said this hat is international in Indian country, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, Iroquois languages, Haudenosaunee speaking language, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Seneca, and Ojibwe are as different from each other as a comparison as Dutch, Somali, and Mandarin Chinese. 3 totally different languages spoken on different continents by different races of people. Yet, so our languages aren't mutually intelligible, yet this is a concept that shows up with each one of our cultures. And I really like to point out that, yes, we're talking about an Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Chippewa perspective of that. And each one of those names is referring to the same people. I know in our treaties with the United States government, they're written as the Chippewa. Another designation for us is the Ojibwe, and our autonym, the name that we have for ourselves, is Anishinaabe. So all 3 of those are the same, and I like to point that out in the very beginning. So I am going to share the screen here. And here we have 7 generations. Now this was once a petroglyph. This was carved into stone, and it's used to, seriously to record knowledge. This may or may not have been moved to a birch bark scroll, which was how people would traditionally carry on knowledge in the woodlands here. And now we're using PowerPoint in Zoom. So the media changes, but the message is still very much the same here. And what we have is this first generation. And this is Nin. And in Ojibwe, this means I, me, myself, Nin. Here's our next generation. We have Nus and Ninga. Nus is my father and Ninga is my mother. And if we have any Ojibwe students or speakers on today, you may note that I'm using an older form of my father in this, Nus. Nowadays, you may hear Nebaba or Ndede, and those are probably borrowings from French and English, the French and English languages. Nebaba is probably from Mopapa, my father, and Ndede is probably from my daddy. But Nus, this sound here, I think we could make a case that this sound Nu could possibly date back to prior to the ending of the last ice age. This is one of those words that show up in every human language. My father, my mother, water, fire, earth, sun, moon, lake, all of these show up. So this is what you're listening to, I think is a sound that could easily be 13,000 years old. That there was someone who saw where we are at right now when this was the mountain of ice. That there was someone who saw woolly mammoths. They saw Misomik. For comparison, there's some of the megafauna. That's a giant moose as well. That's our Ojibwe word for moose. That's where it comes from, moose. At the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, just to give you an idea of how big some of the megafauna were back then. They saw giant moose, they saw woolly mammoths, they saw Misomik. And when I say Misomik, that's our Ojibwe word for giant beaver. When I say giant, these beavers were about the size of Makwa, a black bear. And if you can imagine the size of Makwa at the time, on his hind feet, he stood about 11 to 12 feet high. So before the Great Lakes existed, while these megafauna were roaming the earth, there was someone who referred to his or her father using that sound, Nu, Nu. And we don't know what the ending was. It may have been nul, nuthe, nuse, nuth, but we know that that new sound was there. So I love sharing that with people because sometimes it can be easy to forget the antiquity and how ancient some of the languages that are still spoken here on Mikanako-Minising, here on Turtle Island are. And I'd love to share that with people. Here's our next generation. We have Nimishomis, my grandfather, and I'd love to see, are most of the attendants here from Minneapolis or the Twin Cities urban metro area? Because there's a,
I would say about 70% are Twin
Okay.
Cities Metro, but we've got people from Florida. Often we have people from Alaska. So we've got Texas chiming in. So we've got a little mix, but
Oh,
the
that's
majority
great.
are from Minnesota or greater Minnesota.
Because one of the words I wanted to share with everyone was nokomis, nokomis. If you're from Minneapolis or you're Minneapolitan or you're even from the Twin Cities area and you're in Southside Minneapolis, you'll notice that there's a lake there. I lived for at least 15 years, about 2 miles away from Lake Nokomis. I walked there all the time. I put my son in the stroller and we would walk around, and it was one of my favorite places in the cities to be. And that word literally means my grandmother, my grandmother. So I have Nimishonis, my grandfather, Nokomis, my grandmother. And then our next generation is Indanako-Bichigan, Indanako-Bichigan. That'd be my great grandfather or my great grandmother. And it doesn't exactly mean just that. It has a word part in it, unik. And really what this word part is, it's a morpheme. It's the smallest part of a word that carries meaning. And I became absolutely fascinated by this at a period of my life. And maybe I'll go into that and share how I became fascinated by both the Ojibwe language and by these morphemes. So again, earlier I introduced myself as Kage Gopal. I'm also James Vukelich. I didn't hear the Ojibwe language until I was a 24-year-old man. I was going to be a French teacher. I had actually moved to Canada. I studied at the Université de Québec à Trois-Rivières. I did French immersion there for a year, and it was complete immersion. So if you wanted a cup of coffee or you wanted to find a bathroom, you needed to use the language, French language, to do that. So it was very much a sink or swim situation. And after a year, I came back to Minneapolis and I went to MCTC. And with every intention of finishing my AA and then moving to a university to become a French teacher. And I saw at MCTC, they were offering Ojibwe. And I needed one more class to get my full financial aid package. And so I thought, well, why not? My grandmother, my mother are Ojibwe from Turtle Mountain. Already I've studied French, Italian, a little bit of Latin in middle school. Why not try Ojibwe? And I remember going to the bookstore, picking up Portage Lake, a book by the late Maud Keg, Nawakamakukweban, opening it up and seeing this word, Ogiabajutunawan. And when you see it in double vowel writing, it took up most of the page. I mean, it was a very long word. And I was absolutely fascinated. I was like, who uses a word this long? What does this word mean? How could I have to figure it out? And, you know, in retrospect, it meant they were using it. She was talking about harvesting and manufacturing wild rice. But it was that course where I had learned the most fascinating story about myself that I had never been told. I was absolutely fascinated by the Ojibwe language, and I couldn't study it enough. So despite having moved to another country to learn another language, at that point, I went totally with my passion and with my heart, and began on one of the most exciting intellectual and spiritual journeys I'd ever been on. And that was learning the Ojibwe language. From there, I had a chance to study with Gagi Ibn Isiban, the late Dan Jones, at Fond du Lac College. And then I moved to the University of Minnesota, where I had a chance to study with Onijo Tewan. That means two hearts, his twin brother, Pebama Benes, Dennis Jones. And from there, I had a chance to work as a teacher's assistant. And ultimately, I ended up teaching at the University of Minnesota when I graduated with my undergrad. From there, I started teaching in a number of places, at high schools, inner city high schools, as well as at the university. And when I went back to school, I decided to go into linguistics, which is the scientific study of language. And from there, I thought, well, I didn't grow up with the language, but maybe if I used, there's another point. That totally slipped my mind. I began working on the dictionary, the online Ojibwe dictionary, which is where I've really focused on a lot of these morphemes, these word parts. And I thought, well, if I can see how these morphemes work in different environments, maybe I can get a better understanding of what someone was trying to say 150 years ago, 400 years ago, 800 years ago. And in this case, like that case of Nu, maybe thousands of years ago. So I began looking at it, and here's one, Anikanutake, Anikanutake. That word literally means to translate. It's describing how translation works. It's saying a word in one language and then repeating that word in the target language of your audience. Our next one would be Anake Ogama, Anake Ogama. And something that's maybe apropos to current events, we could say Anake Ogamakwe. That's a vice president, it's a vice chief, it's a vice principal. It's someone who fulfills the role of the leader if the current leader can no longer do so. So Anake Ogama would be a male vice chief, vice president. Anake Ogamakwe would mean a female vice president. So I'm thrilled to have a chance to say that. We have Anake Gama. Where I grew up in north central Minnesota, we had a number of these. These are chains of lakes, bodies of water that are connected by bays, by rivers, by streams, but they're interconnected. And then we have Anakopidun, Anakopidun. That's to tie together. I don't know if we have any bead workers or people who sew, but when you run out of thread and then you tie another piece of thread to it, that is Anakopidun. You have interconnected them. So when I asked an elder what that word Indonako Bichigan meant to him, he looked at me and he knew I had a Western education. And to him, he said, it's like the links in a bike chain. For him, this Anako was to be interconnected, was to be interlinked. So from his perspective, here we have Indonako Bichigan, my great-grandparents, Nimishomis Nokomis, my grandparents, Nus Ninga, my parents, Kainin, and myself, I. So if we were to translate that word, Indonako Bichigan, it could mean my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother. Another translation would mean my ancestor. So I could refer to that person I spoke about 13,000 years ago as Indonako Bichigan, my ancestor. But if I were to spiritually translate this phrase, it would mean that being I am inextricably interconnected to, that being I am inextricably linked to. And in Ojibwe, it's also our word for my great-grandchild, my great-grandson or my great-granddaughter. So they're using the same term for each other, Indonako Bichigan. I am inextricably linked to you. I am inextricably interconnected to you. And whatever's going to affect me is going to affect you. Sometimes I wonder if they're actually saying, I am you. I am you. So if we look at this petroglyph holistically, we have, if it works going up, it should work going down. So here we'll start at the top. We have Nin. I, me, myself. I have Engosis, Gaia Endonis. Engosis is my son, Endonis is my daughter. Here we have Nujus, my grandchild, and that's if I'm speaking to them. And actually, I have to amend this. This was when I was in the Lake of the Woods area in Kenora in Ontario. That's how they would say my grandchild, my grandson, or my granddaughter. Here in Minnesota, you may hear Nuzis with a Z rather than a ZH sound. Both are mutually intelligible. A fluent speaker hearing this would either know if you're from the north or if you're from the south. So here we have I, me, myself, my son, my daughter, my grandchild, and then our next generation is Indonako Pichigan, my great grandson, my great granddaughter, my great grandchild. And they refer to me as Indonako Pichigan, my great grandparent. So if we look at this, what we have here, if we start at the top, we have Indonako Pichigan, Beijing, Nimishomis, Nokumis, Nij, my grandparents, Nus, Inga, my father, my mother, Niswe, 3, Nin, I, me, myself, 4, Ingosis, Indonis, my son, my daughter, Nanan, 5, Nujis, my grandchild, Ingodwaswe, 6, and Indanako Bichigan, my great grandchild, my great grandson, my great granddaughter, Nijwaswe. What we have here is a model of 7 generations that are punctuated intergenerationally by this concept of I am inextricably interconnected to you. I am inextricably linked to you. And the first time I saw this model, I was really taken aback because it brought up a number of teachings for me that happened both spiritually as well as scientifically. And, you know, some of this idea of interconnection with spirituality, this shows up all over the world in a number of different religious traditions. Here's a word many of you have probably heard before: karma. Karma. It's a Sanskrit word. In ancient Sanskrit, it literally means a deed or an action. So in Eastern Asian religions, you can have good karma or bad karma. And your karma will be determined on if you choose to do actions out of benevolence, being altruistic, being kind and generous, or maybe you're being mischievous or misanthropic. Maybe you are mean-spirited or greedy, but their idea is that whatever you put out is what will come back to you. From an Ojibwe perspective, this is an action that will have a reaction, that will have a reaction, that will have a reaction, that will happen intergenerationally. This also shows up in Middle Eastern religions. I think in the New Testament, it's you'll reap what you sow. Whatever seed you plant in the ground, that is what you should expect to grow. And I think Jesus is even more explicit about this when he states, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. Your actions will have consequences. That word consequence literally meaning con, with, and sequence, in a sequence, with a sequence. So some of the spiritual traditions that I saw with interconnection, with being interlinked, have something happening in a sequence, working with that word part, oniko. But then also scientifically speaking, this was a law of physics. Here's the third law. For reaction, there's going to be an equal reaction. Einstein's going to refine that and say that reaction is going to be based on its relationship. That's a very indigenous concept. It's based on its on relativity. And then the first time I saw this, after here I heard the teachings, I was floored because when I saw a double helix, it really made me ask myself the question, what did I inherit from my great-grandparents? What am I passing down to my children, my grandchildren, and my great-grandchildren? And it's my DNA. It's our DNA. We are interconnected that way. And when I looked at the double helix, I literally saw links and in the very building blocks of my being. And this was part of a topic that came up while I was doing field work on the Ojibwe dictionary, when I had a chance to talk and speak to elders about learning the language, because any chance I had, I would ask them, how can I be a more effective language learner? How can I learn it quicker or more effectively? Because I really wanted to learn, and it was something I wanted to share with the community. And so often, and this would happen a number of times, they would say, the language is already in you. It's already been passed down to you. It's already in your, the term they used was blood memory. And the first time I heard that, I have to admit, I'll call myself out on this. I did not readily believe that, because I was in a very academic, acquisitive, competitive, scientific atmosphere at that time. So not to discount what they were saying, but without having done any research or looking into it, I didn't readily believe it. And it would happen that people were looking into this. And for them, what was blood memory was termed as a intergenerational trauma. And I don't know if you're maybe surprised if I told you that I didn't hear the Ojibwe language until I was a 24-year-old man. But there's a very good reason for that. And it actually starts with my great-grandfather. And this concept of intergenerational trauma. And, you know, when I looked at our experience and I began comparing it to some of the research that's been done lately on epigenetics and on the legacy of intergenerational trauma, what the science is showing is that someone who goes through something incredibly traumatic in their life, particularly a child, if you go through something traumatic, it will alter you. So some of the first studies were done with Holocaust, descendants of Holocaust survivors. And what they were noting is that if you go through something incredibly traumatic in your life, and you know, to talk about the Holocaust is one of the most traumatic things. When you are one night roused from your house, you're forcibly moved to a ghetto. From there, you're put on a cattle cart and shipped to a concentration camp to be systematically exterminated. You are going to go through a great deal of things. There's going to be, you know, for me, the spiritual part is the long, dark night of the soul, asking yourself, how is this happening? Why is this happening? The emotional trauma of so much loss, of losing the people you hold dearest in your life. The emotional strain, the mental strain, again, asking, how can this be happening? If you, each one of these experiences you're going through is going to produce chemicals in your body that are literally going to alter your DNA. It is going to change your fundamental being. And the body, with its natural intelligence, is doing this so it can give the next generation of people, your descendants, a better chance of surviving in this new environment. And so for me, when I began looking at this and comparing it to my family story, my great-grandfather, he must have gone through a great deal of transformation. He was born in 1870. So, you know, there was a period of time where, being from Turtle Mountain in the Cypress Hills in Canada, where he lived in a teepee. He hunted buffalo. The buffalo herds were still there. And then there will come a period where there's a complete loss of liberty, where he has to live on the reservation. And if he leaves the reservation, or if he goes off the reservation, I think is the term that everyone uses, he would be deemed a hostile, an enemy combatant. He could be shot at that time, totally legally. So there's a loss of liberty. It may sound strange to some of you, but before I began my talk, I smudged with sweetgrass and I introduced myself using the language. In the reservation period at that time, you could be arrested for something like that. You wouldn't do hard time, but you would do a night in jail. You would lose a day's wages, most likely. There's also the harassment of having to go home after having spent another night in jail for literally speaking your language or for using medicine. And then if I look at my story, I mean, why didn't I ever hear the language before I was a 24-year-old man? And the real reason for that is because my mother and my grandmother went to boarding and residential schools. My mother went to a boarding school and my grandmother went to a residential school. That's what they call the boarding schools in Canada. And these were environments where the sociological term, it's a total institution. And a total institution is a place where what you eat, when you wake up, where you sleep, what you read, how you pray, the language you speak, how you line up to go to the bathroom, all of these are determined for you by the system. And we still have total institutions. Two perfect examples would be a prison and the military. Yet you have children who are going to these boarding schools, and so many went through incredibly traumatic times there. They were taken out of an environment, out of their home at 4, 5, and 6. All of my Ojibwe teachers were boarding school survivors, and they were submerged. It was submersive rather than immersive education where they were forced to learn French or English. And in that trauma, we have a loss of language in our communities. We have a loss of culture. We have a loss of history and spirituality. And, you know, for myself, when you begin learning the language, you can feel a little angry, like, why wasn't I taught this? But when you begin to learn the history of it, you begin to understand that there's a very good reason why one hasn't learned their language or learned their culture yet. And in this context, I have so many friends, and in my generation, you were never arrested for speaking the language or practicing ceremony. You were able to learn language in school. You can, of course, you have the liberty of leaving the reservation and living wherever you want. Yet, we see so many issues in our community today. Issues like substance abuse. I know the opiate epidemic as well as a methamphetamine epidemic are taking place in our communities. And there are other ways that people may be dealing with a pain that is not their own. This could be gambling. This could be chronic overspending. This could be unsafe sexual practices. Something to numb a pain that is inside of them that may not be theirs, that is something that may have been inherited from one of their relatives. And I think that the moment you understand that you may have inherited someone's pain that is not your own, that can be a catalyst for healing. The moment you're able to recognize that, you can begin healing it. But if you're unaware of it, you're ignorant of it, then it can cause and wreak great havoc in your life. So to make that a catalyst for healing is incredibly important. And there's one other point I want to make here. We didn't just inherit trauma from our ancestors. The fact that I'm able in 2021 to use the language, to use words and concepts and philosophical teachings that are literally thousands and thousands of years old, it shows that we have also inherited great strength of heart, resilience, compassion, strength, character, that these too were passed down to us. And that despite that systematic effort to destroy, to kill the Indian to save the man, that was the mandate of boarding schools, that despite the systematic effort to destroy the language and the culture and the spirituality, that it has endured. And so I like to acknowledge that to put your head in the ground and say that we didn't inherit trauma, I think would be foolish, but to also acknowledge the truth that we inherited great gifts as well. And particularly the endurance to carry this on, hopefully to the next generation, is incredibly important to note. And so the first time I heard this teaching, I was floored because it had begun making sense to me. And the fellow who shared this teaching with me, he was from the Lake of the Woods area in Canada. He was born on a trap line. Again, no roads, electricity, running water. Everything you got came from the earth at that time. And he noted that as a young man, that the elders in his community would try to avoid using this word neen, I, me, myself. And I don't know if you know the translation of neen into Latin, but it's ego. In Latin would be pronounced ego. And everyone who is watching this has dealt with someone who is egotistical, egocentric, a term we've heard for some years recently. It has been egomaniacal, someone who is thinking exclusively of themselves. I am looking out after number one. I am seeking out to become more educated, more sophisticated, more cultured, more wealthy, more attractive than you. I am seeking out to be number one. I am thinking of myself. And what they were doing there when they were avoiding using that word, they were dealing with this concept of really this word, I, me, myself, from a linguistic and grammatical point of view. It makes sense and it serves a function, but it's not real. This idea of I is not real for them. I am a link in the chain that's going all the way back and going all the way forward. I am inextricably connected to all of my relatives, and everything I do is going to affect them, and everything they do is going to affect me. So this is one that shows up in other indigenous languages as well. All of my relatives. I am all of my relatives, and all of my relatives are me. And everything I do is going to affect all of my relatives, and everything they do is going to affect me. And I have to tell you, the thrill of actually understanding that concept, which I had heard so often learning the language in the first years, what that really meant and what the concept of 7 generations really meant, that idea of interconnection, of being interlinked. I felt a great thrill, and I was very excited, but it was short-lived, because what this had showed me, all of a sudden I began feeling anxiety, almost dread, because the language had proven to me both scientifically and spiritually that every single action I'm doing, every word, every gesture, every decision is going to not just affect my great-grandchildren, but their great-grandchildren. And my question became, well, how? How do you do it? Because it had answered this, maybe teenage angst, existential question, like, why am I here? Why do I exist? Maybe if you have teenagers, I was a teenager once and asked this question of my parents, why am I here? I didn't ask for this. The language and culture had answered this for me. You're here because you're related, because you're inextricably interconnected. They always knew that we would be here in 2021 because we're inextricably interconnected to them. So for me, the question was no longer, why am I here? The question became, how? How do I live then? That brings a peace and balance to my relatives. How can I live without conflict with them? How can I live without contradiction? Saying one thing and then doing another. And you know, people all over the world have been asking this question. Here's Mahavira. And in the Jain religion, he spoke of moksha or mukti, liberation from that cycle of karma that we spoke of. Freedom from that cycle of karma. This is the Buddha. And in the language he spoke, Pali, it was Nibbana. That's how he would have said it. Later, when it gets translated into the languages of the priests, it becomes nirvana in Sanskrit. The cessation of desire, the putting out of the flames of desire. In ancient China, Lao Tzu, in his contemporary Confucius, spoke of the Tao, going along with the flow of the universe. In ancient Greece, Socrates spoke of living the examined life, stating that the unexamined life was not worth living. And in the Middle East, Jesus spoke of the kingdom of heaven, that spark of light that he found within himself. And our ancestors called this Minopomatsu, the good life, a life of peace, a life of balance, a life without conflict with your relatives, a life without contradiction, doing one thing and then saying another. To give you an idea of another way, translation of this would mean living well, also to have a good health. Good health being the natural consequence of leading a good life. You know, to compare this, to give you an idea, here is some sister languages of ours, Odawa and Budewatmi, or you would probably heard of them as the Potawatomi. They say Minopamatsi. For our relatives, the Cree, the Nehiyaw speakers, and Innu speakers, they call it Minopamatsu. And in the plains, it's Miopamatsu. The only reason I show you this is to kind of lay out, it takes a long time for one word to become a word in many different languages. So for context, before the Buddha spoke of the Noble Eightfold Path, before the Sermon on the Mount, before Socrates was in the marketplaces of Athens, there was one of our descendants who was using this concept of a word. So this is another word that is literally thousands and thousands of years old. So, and maybe for this first part, do you mind if I ask if we have any questions? We've literally gone over like thousands of years of stuff. Family models from a different culture other than, you know, your American-based one, different meanings of words. I'd gladly take a few questions now, and then we'll go into what is Minopamatsuin and literally how can we do that?
Mm-hmm. There was one question, namely, will you share your slides so that people can go back and read this again and think about it some more? Is that something you can do?
Sure, I'm not quite done with it yet because I've been doing this presentation, thank goodness, all over North America. I'm putting one together that's kind of like a bare bones of it, where you can see the names and the grandfather teachings. And so, yeah, when I get that done, I'll post that to my website. I'll share that website with you all at the end.
That would be great. Thank you. Anyone else have questions or go ahead and either type it in the chat or go ahead and unmute, and we'd love to hear from you.
Nope.
Well, should we talk about Minopamatsuin for a little bit?
Sure.
Great, I'll share this screen here. So one of my questions as a linguist and as a scientist, when I learned of Minapumatsuen, and I thought that this philosophical perspective, this concept, really demanded of me to ask this question: what does life mean then in the language? How did my ancestors define this concept of living? And when I looked at some of the first efforts in Algonquian linguistics, Leonard Bloomfield, he wrote in one of his most famous papers about bimatasi and about this preverb here, bimi. And for him, he broke it down that bimi means along in space or time, or in a continuum, So I think it's important to note that you can't just live in Ojibwe, you have to live a certain way. So you could have a Baba Matasi to travel around, Giwanatasi to be crazy. But Bimi also shows up in a number of words. So you can have Bimatasi, to live, Bimose, to walk, it's to start in one place, walk, and then end in another. You can do this with running as well, Bimibatu, or to fly, Bimise. But you get this whole idea of a continuum where you have a beginning point, you're in flight, you're walking, you're running, you're living, and then you have an end point. And Atazi is, again, to have a particular character. So you can't just live, you have to live a certain way. And I know that's a little different than in English. And when I first heard this, it made sense because one of my teachers brought up, which was for him the path of life. I wonder if it's in this one. Here it is. And it was the four hills of life. And this came from a holy man, a medicine man who had a dream and had a vision. And for him, he saw 4 stages of life that people go through. That mystical number 4 will show up in so many Algonquian or in so many indigenous societies here in Turtle Island. So the first hill of life was the Abenugians. This is the baby, this is the infant. The next stage of life would be the Abenugi, the child. Then one becomes an Ikwe, Gemage, Inini. You become a woman or a man. And really, we actually have this one small special period of life where we call someone an Oshkinawe or an Oshkinigikwe. That would mean literally a new man or a new woman. This is someone maybe 16 to 20 who is physically an adult, but may not be ready to go on that enterprise of starting a family, being able to look after, both parents and your children, being able to clothe and feed and shelter them. So it's that period of life before you become a man or a woman. Maybe if you've ever heard that name Skinaway, that's where that comes from, Oshkinaway. And then after you are a man or woman, if you are given that great gift of long life, you can become a Kichiaya. And really, that's the only time I've heard Anishinaabe who are very humble, the Ojibwe people who are very humble, refer to someone as being great, and that's an elder. Kichiaya means literally a great being. You can be an Mindamuye, an old woman. And I know in English that seems derisive, but in Ojibwe, that word Mindamuye, it means to minge, to hold together with your hands, and Uye, the being. She's the being that holds us together. She holds our families together, our clans together, our villages together, and ultimately our nations together. It's literally what that word old woman means. And it's an honorific, it's practical, it's a very respectful way to speak of an elder. And then we have an Akiwenzi, an old man. Someone who, literally that word means he comes from the earth. Someone who has been fed, clothed, and sheltered by the earth. has become the earth, and the earth is him. And so this is how they would describe these 4 stages of life. And then ultimately, we know that people pass on, that people die. So when I first heard Bamatsu, that made sense. You have a beginning point, you were born. You'll have a human experience, and then ultimately you'll perish. This is what's happened for every single human being that's ever been here. And when I was first studying Ojibwe, there was an elder. Again, this is 21 years ago. There was an elder who had passed away, and he was a fluent first language speaker. He was we would call him a Gete Anishinaabe. Again, he was born on a trap line. He had lived off of the land for a part of his life. He was, Gete would be old time. He was like an old time Indian. And when he passed away, my teacher shared this word with me that he said he heard elders use, and that was Giwe. He has gone home. He has returned home. So what he was speaking about there wasn't necessarily, he was talking about the spirit world. And then this changed my idea of what Bamatsun was. It was something eternal. It could be our soul, our spirit, whichever name you choose for that. Coming here to this world, being born, having a human experience, and then returning to whence it came. So for me, this word, Bamatazi, it wasn't just he or she is living in a continuum. If I were to spiritually translate that word, that sentence, it would mean the eternal moving through the impermanent. We know our bodies have a beginning and an end, yet the spirit or the soul that is animating them doesn't. And that comes here, it has human experience and then leaves. So then my next question became, well, what does this word minnow mean? You know, Ojibwe minnow is typically good. Minnow gijigat, it is a good day. Nimin wendum, I'm glad, I'm happy. Niminawaya, I'm well. But there was an elder in Barons River. And when he was asked about this picture, he described this as being minnow. And the story that accompanied it was, for me, absolutely fascinating. This is, we will call this being Benesi, a thunderbird, fighting Missiganabik, a giant serpent. So for us, the thunder beings, when they're gigantic birds, when they flap their wings, that's the sound of thunder, and they have lightning coming out of their eyes. And they are locked in conflict with Missiganabik, the giant serpents. And so what this man was explaining here was that if Benesi does not hunt Missiganabik, the giant serpents will overrun the world and it will be uninhabitable by everyone. There will only be giant serpents. However, if Missiganabik does not feed Benesi, Benesi could not exist. So what we're really seeing here is an indigenous version of a yin yang. One cannot live without the other. You would not have a complete whole here, a circle, if you did not have both the black and the white taking place. So what he was describing as minnow was balance. That this idea of the good, it comes out of being in balance. So what may seem like to us as conflict taking place here is actually the establishment of balance. And in fact, in each one of us, hopefully we have conflict taking place in our bodies. We have white blood cells that are attacking things that could become illness. It could be germs, it could be bacteria. But so at that level, it may seem like conflict, but what it's really doing is bringing us health. Also, we'll notice this with hunting. If there are periods where you do not hunt the white-tailed deer. They will very quickly overpopulate, and then there will not be enough food for them and they'll begin starving. Yet, in this idea of symbiosis, that they're working with each other, there is a balance there. And when that hunting takes place, Anishinaabe is fed and clothed, and in some cases even given shelter. And there are enough deer that are able to inhabit and feed off of the land and to be healthy and to have generation after generation comes. So Minopumatsuin really became for me the eternal is moving through the impermanent and complete peace and balance with all of its surroundings. Be really what living well is. And I wanted to do that. My question became how? How do you seek out this good life? And the good news is that our ancestors have left this for us. One way of describing it was the Gitchi Debakonegewanan. Another was, and this came from the late Richard Morrison. I had a chance to sit with him at Fort Francis at Guchiching, where he called this the Gagigeanakonegewan. So Gitchi Debakonegewan, Gitchi means great. Dib is to speak. Akon is with a wood-like article in the hand. So nowadays, if fluent speakers hear you say Debakonege, they'll giggle because it means a judge nowadays. What the person is relating is a ruling or a sentence. The wood-like article in their hand is a gavel. But what we're looking at something far more ancient than gavels in the Western legal system here. What they're actually speaking about is the sacred pipe stem, the Vukelich. Maybe you've heard of this as a peace pipe. This is the wood-like article that they're holding. So what you may not know about the history or about the culture and the spirituality is that this is one of maybe our greatest gifts that we were given. This was an implement that we were given to pray with, to give thanks with, to ask the Creator for help and aid and assistance. I don't know if you noticed, even signing our peace treaties, when we smoked the pipe with one another, we were making a solemn vow before the Creator, before the Manadu, before God, that we would keep our word. So really, if I were to translate Gitchi Jabakonegewan, it would mean the great law or the sacred law. The Gagigeanakonegewan would mean the eternal law. It has always been this way. It's not subject to the laws of change. And we also call these the 7 grandfather teachings. And this first one, De Buewen, truth, is one I absolutely find fascinating. Here, I'm nominalizing, and I do this for different audiences. I don't think our ancestors would have used it this way. I think they would have said, De Bue, he or she speaks the truth. This is a complete sentence in Ojibwe. It's a word sentence, and we really don't have those in English, but he or she speaks the truth. It's an action. It's something you do. Each one of these sacred laws would literally be a verb. But if we put the win at the end of it, it turns it into a noun. So De Bue, he or she speaks the truth. De Buewen, truth. And I don't know if you remember when we broke down some of those words, like in Donako Bichigan, we got a very different meaning from that rather than just the translation into English. We had, rather than just my great grandparent, my ancestor, or my great grandchild, we have someone I'm inextricably interconnected to. When I first heard this from the late Basil Johnson, he was an Anishinaabe linguist from Canada. He spoke at the University of Minnesota, and he spoke about his interpretation of De Buewen, or De Bue. And for him, this was Deb to a certain extent, and way to speak. And he explained this very vividly in a story about his community where he was from. He lived in a remote fly-in community. And this would have been in like the 1930s or even 1940s. And when I say a remote flying community, the only way you could get there was by plane. You could fly in and land on the lake. Maybe in the winter you could dog sled or snowmobile there, but there were no roads that led here. So this was an isolated community, yet it was insulated. So you had a number of monolingual first language Ojibwe speakers there who used Ojibwe on a daily basis because everyone they spoke to used Ojibwe. They had very few dealings with people who spoke English or French at the time. And so he described that court would come to his community once a month. They would fly in, there would be a judge, legal representation, translators. They would set up in the band office, which was the central administration for the government, for the tribal government there. And they would have court. And because there were so many monolingual speakers, they had to bring in translators. And when they tried to translate the phrase to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, there was something lost in translation where the fluent first language speaker said, no, I can't do that. And what they were saying is not that I can't tell you the truth, but I can only speak to a certain extent. I can only tell you what I saw, what I witnessed, what I heard, what I experienced. That may or may not be the whole truth. I can only tell you my truth. I can only speak to a certain extent from my perspective. And also the speaking to a certain extent means not leaving things out as well. You're expressing it without omitting or adding. You're speaking your truth. And so for me, I thought that was a very beautiful way of describing one way of telling the truth, to speak your truth. And then when I looked at it the way, this concept of truth, the way that Socrates or Buddha or Jesus or Mahavira or Lao Tzu sought out truth. And for them, this is something eternal. This is something that doesn't have a beginning or an end. It doesn't change. It is the truth. And I wonder if the language is actually, the spirit of the language is censoring itself here. I personally think it's trying to say, I cannot define something eternal to you. If you are using language, which is the sound of our thought, to define something eternal, then you're using the wrong tool for this endeavor. It's not going to work. I can only describe it to a certain extent. You'll have to experience it. So then my question became, well, if you can't pass truth down using language, using thought, then how did our ancestors seek it out? And that's where I began investigating both the culture and the spirituality of our ancestors. And one of the most ancient ceremonies I found is called the vision quest. Something I like in a live audience setting is asking, or maybe a show of hands if you've ever heard of a vision quest. In Ojibwe, we would call it Gi Agoshimo. He or she seeks out a dream. He or she fasts for a vision. And I found one account that was written completely in Ojibwe by a chief at Fort William on Thunder Bay in Canada, in the North Shore of Lake Superior. And he narrated this in 1904, and he was already a very old man at the time. So he spoke of his first time fasting, and this must have been in the 1830s or 1840s. So he still lived in a lodge. He got all of his food, his clothing, his shelter from the land. And he recalled being woken up by his father one day. And when he said my father, he was using the old language too. He called him Noos, my dad, my father. And his dad was holding two birch bark dishes. I can actually do this now. Something like this. This one particular one has medicines in it: cedar, asema tobacco, mitigo, kinnikinnick, or wood tobacco. One had meat in it, food. It had wias, venison, minan, berries, blueberries, maybe gigu, fish, manoman, wild rice in it. and the other one had a kakanje, charcoal, charred wood. So the boy is being presented a choice. And there's an incredibly important spiritual teaching that's taking place right now. No one can do it for you. No one can make you do it. If you choose to have a spiritual experience, it has to be done to your own volition. No one can make you do it. Grandma and grandpa can't do it for you. You have to make that choice. So if he were to have chosen breakfast, he would have been fed. He wouldn't have been reprimanded or grounded. He would have just been fed breakfast. It would not have been his time. But he chose the akakanche, the charred wood. The old man picked up the piece of charcoal and marked his face with it several times, makadeke, to blacken the face. And for the next 4 days and 3 nights, if anyone saw him, they would not offer him traditional hospitality, a cup of tea, something to eat, visit with him. They would leave him alone, and he would seek out isolation. And for those next 4 days and 3 nights, he would go without food. He would go without water in isolation, and he would begin seeking out a dream. Now, that first night of the vision quest, I don't know if any of you have had to fast for either spiritual or medical reasons, but I think every day past day 1 without water becomes very uncomfortable. And if you can imagine this 8-year-old boy on his own, as the sun is setting, he's already getting thirsty. He's already getting hungry. It's starting to get cold. He must be asking himself, well, one, grandma and grandpa must be coming out to get me pretty soon. Or mom and dad wouldn't just leave me out here. And I think his next question would be, if I were to get food right now, where would I get it? Where would I get water? How would I get clothing to stay warm? How would I create a shelter? And right now he is learning the next grandfather teaching, our next sacred law of Dabaseng Dazawan, humility. Because he's having an experience. Well, really, if we look at this word humility, let's start here with dabas, low, ain, to think, and dizo of oneself. I think lowly of myself. He's learning an incredibly important teaching here. Pose this as a question and then answer it. But what happens to a human being without food, water, clothing, or shelter? And he is learning in real time through a real lived experience that you will die. You will certainly perish without these basic core human needs being met. So when you hear stories of our ancestors finding people like traders and settlers who were lost, of pilgrims, of people who were arriving here and didn't know how to survive on Turtle Island and being fed and being clothed and being given medicine, they were doing this because this was embedded, it was ingrained in the spiritual tradition, it was ingrained in the spirituality. Someone who has gone through this experience has a real, genuine empathy for someone else who maybe without these basic human needs being met. This boy for the rest of his life will be able to say, I too have felt cold. I've felt hunger and loneliness and thirst. And if I can alleviate that for you, I will. I will help you. I know what that's like. And so his next question or his next realization must be, well, where do I get my food? Where do I get my clothing? Where do I get my shelter? Where do I get the medicine? The mushkaki in Ojibwe, it's a beautiful word. It literally means the strength of the earth. For mushk, strength, and aki, the earth. When Anishinaabe is ill, the human being is ill, they go to the earth to find healing. Where do I get all of these things? And they all come from the earth, especially in the 1830s. His meat, his venison, comes from the Owesiug, the four-legged, from the Benesiug, the birds, from the giguyug, the fish. The medicine comes from the earth as well as the monomen, the wild rice, and the mandamen, the corn. All of this comes from the earth. And earlier I spoke about all of my relatives from Indinoy Maganadok, all of my relations from a genetic point of view. But now he is realizing, wait, I have a relationship with the four-legged. I have a relationship with the winged ones. I have a relationship to the swimmers. I have a relationship to the mittagug, to the trees that are literally giving me the air I breathe, that are giving me fire and shelter. And I certainly have a relationship with Nabi, the water that's giving life to all of it. And it is that relationship then that makes us relatives. So when he's speaking of all of my relatives, he's not just saying the people I am related to by blood and DNA, but of all of the relationships I have. If we have a relationship, then we are relatives. And when he uses this term, Ndabasendis, I think lowly of myself. What he's literally saying is, I am not more important than the relatives who are giving me life. In fact, I think lowly of myself. I know that without you, I cannot possibly survive. So this genuine sense of humility is to say, I do not exalt myself above my relatives. I have put Anishinaabe where they belong, where they are being looked after by the relatives. It's for me that true idea of humility. And in that sense of humility comes Manachi Itiwan, respect. The moment he realizes that for him to have makazinan, makazin, that's our Ojibwe word for moccasin, to have leather shoes, to have clothing. Earlier I told you all that my heritage is from Turtle Mountain. These were a buffalo people. The buffalo fed us. They gave us clothing. They gave us shelter with hide teepees. They gave us tools. They gave us everything. And, here would be another question. Would it then be a good idea for us to go out and kill all of the buffalo, or would that be catastrophically stupid? Because if there were no more buffalo, then we would not survive. So this idea of Manaji Ituan, when you break that word down, Manaji, it really means to go easy on. And maybe this is something you've heard about Indigenous peoples. Take only what you need. Take enough to feed yourself, to clothe yourself, to give yourself shelter, to look after your relatives, and then leave the rest behind. For example, with the buffalo, that's the reason when the settlers arrive, the people who arrive here to colonize North America, find herds 50 to 60 million strong. There are buffalo in the woods that are now extinct. There are buffalo in the swamps. They're in the mountains. They're in the Great Plains. They're in the north. And because they only took enough to look after themselves, they left the rest behind. And in today's talk, there's another point I want to make here with this word part in it. I think it's just so cool. Idi. This is a reciprocal in Ojibwe. It means they do it to one another. From an Ojibwe perspective, it is the moose, Wawashkeshi, the deer, Omashkuz, the elk, Adik, the caribou, who is walking in front of the gun or the bow and arrow. It's the fish that is swimming into the net. They know they're doing it. It is Nigig, Amik, Wajashk, the otter, the beaver, the muskrat, who is going into the trap by their own volition, who are actually saying, I am going to look after my younger sibling. If we do not feed and clothe and shelter this being, they will die. We are going to go easy on the human beings. We are going to look after them. So this idea of Manaji Duin is they go easy on one another. They show respect and care for one another. I like to translate this one too. They acknowledge the sanctity in each other's lives. I acknowledge you as a sacred being. And if you ask yourself, why would someone do that for me? Who else in my life, if you're a little child that you're asking yourself, who else in my life looks after me, feeds me, clothes me, gives me medicine when I am sick, gives me a place to live. And be my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents. And why are they doing that? Because they love us, because they have compassionate, unconditional love for us. So earlier, when I was talking about truth, Dave Waywen, I was saying that the language cannot define something eternal. I look at love as being something eternal, really having not a beginning nor an end. So what we're not looking here at a word like this, we're not looking at a definition of love. I think what we're looking at is a description. It has this word part in it, zog, which is to emerge. This is one of my friend's names, Zagachiwe. Zagachiwe. Zog means to emerge, and Aju is a mountain. So something I like to point out with this next slide, this is literally something the boy would see at the end of his first night fasting. I've had a chance to visit this place. It's Anamakiwaju. It's Thunderbird Mountain, Mount McKay. And here he's looking at Wenabosho, the sleeping giant. And in a moment, you'll see Sagachiwe. The person coming from behind the mountain, it could be someone who comes from behind a hill or a mountain and comes into view. But the being they're speaking about here is Gimeshomasanon, our grandfather. It's the sun. And when the sun comes out, when the sun emerges from beyond sight, from beyond vision, from beyond thought, the sun illuminates everyone and everything. The sun shines everywhere. What I think they're trying to do with a word like that is not define what love is, but to describe what does the Creator's unconditional love look like for Anishinaabe, for the world. And it has to be something for everyone and everything, like the sun shining on all things. It shows up in another word, Zagibaga, to bud. One of my favorite moons. I like them all, but I have a special admiration and love for Zakibagagis. That's the budding moon. It's May. And for me, I remember so many years, just as the days begin getting warmer, as the snow is melted, the days are now longer, the thunder beings fly, there are thunderstorms. All of a sudden, you'll be strolling along the boulevards of Minneapolis, and you'll notice that these once barren branches on the trees almost overnight seem to have life exploding out of them, and there are buds blooming. And so this idea of Zog is something emerging from deep within one, and then coming out for the benefit of everyone. Here is Mandamin, corn. It's the wonder seed. And after it's been planted, and after the thunderstorms and the longer days and the warmer weather, somewhere deep within this kernel of corn, life emerges. And when this corn comes to fruition, this will feed a thief or a teacher, a priest or a prostitute. So when they're asking, what does that unconditional love look like? It has to be something for everyone and everything. And I like how this word is actually trying to describe in action. We can come up with our own definitions sometimes of love. And if it doesn't fit that paradigm that we've created, we say that it's not. But when I looked at it, I looked at my own life and I'm like, you know what? There's never been a song, a poem, a painting, or a sculpture that has ever captured that feeling you have for grandma and grandpa, for your children or grandchildren, for your parents, aunts, uncles, or cousins. It's ineffable. It can't be described with words. And when you look at it, you can never genuinely say that I am going to love someone. I think we've all probably tried at one point in our lives, I'm going to love this person, but it's never authentic. It doesn't come from thought. It has to emerge from somewhere deep within us. And when it does, it can be for the benefit of all of our relatives. There's another word that we use is Joanum, to pity, to bless, to love unconditionally. And this is really one of the reasons the boy is fasting. He is seeking out help from, he's learning about his relationship to the world. He's also seeking help from other than human helpers. We would call them a buagan, a dream helper. Sometimes this is translated into English as my spirit animal, but really this is something far deeper. Is I want you all to maybe put yourself that in a place where you see this little boy who has soot and dirt all over his face, who's already beginning to look thin from hunger, from thirst, who is all alone. And what does that elicit out of you? It would be a sense, and all of us, we're all hardwired to feel this. And what they're doing here is they're using spiritual technology with an other than human spirit helper. They're trying to get this being to take pity on me. When he has gone out to fast, he's not wearing his finest regalia. He's not arrayed in eagle feathers. He is presenting himself as someone who is humble and someone who is in need of pity and love and a blessing. So really, and you'll hear this at the end of ceremonies. Dagar Joanna Mishanam, Joanna Mishanam, Joanna Mishanam, Joanna Mishanam. Please have pity on us. Please love all of us unconditionally. And please bless us. You know, there's a story for that will be our next month. We're at the 25th of January, but there's going to be the new moon, and so it would be a new moon for us. We would call this the Name Benigizis, the suckerfish moon. And the reason they call it that is if we go Mewinja, a long time ago, definitely pre-contact, there can be incredibly cold winters. I know some of my friends in Canada right now are going through an incredibly cold winter. It's like 46 below with a wind chill up there. And when it gets that cold, sometimes animals will sit down for an entire month. They will hunker down. They will get through the month, and as it begins to warm up, they'll begin moving. Now, if you're hunting and gathering people, this can become very difficult. And there was a year where it was incredibly cold for a very long time. And so as the animals hunkered down, as the food stores of wild rice and corn became depleted, hunger and starvation set in. And they did what they were instructed to do when times became very tough. This is maybe like the 8th day of not eating. They prayed for help. They used the pipe, they used the tobacco to ask for help. And one night, a man had a dream where Namabin, a bottom dweller, the suckerfish, greeted him in his dream and said, "If you set your nets up under the ice, I will swim into them and I will feed you." Because at this time, when it gets very cold, most fish will go to the bottom of the lake, of the river, but the bottom dwellers will go towards the ice. And so the next day they set up their nets, and Namabin alleviated their hunger. He saved their lives. This is what I'm talking about. Oshruenaman, in you, Anishinabin, Namabin. The suckerfish took pity on these relatives who were starving to death. Through the suckerfish's unconditional love, they gave their lives to us so that we could eat. And in that we received the blessing of love. And so when we're saying that, that's what we're asking for. All of us will go through periods where we are in definite need, and we've suffered loss and hardship, where we'll need that pity, that love, and that blessing. So there's a couple of different words to say love. And when you have that in your heart, that can transform your very being. Here's our next sacred law of courage, of bravery. I love the translation of courage in it because it has that Latin cor in it for heart. And Ojibwe has the same thing. when we speak of someone being courageous in the language, we're saying, Zungire, he or she has a strong heart. And there was a story that radically transformed my perspective of what does it mean to have a strong heart. And it came from the Dewe'egan. These are what we would call Buanji Dewe'egan, Dakota drums. And how they came to the Anishinaabe was, it's a very dark story, but it's also very enlightening too. We can use both that black and white. And it's said that in the 1860s or the 1870s, and it was just the Dakotas at that time. It could have been North or South Dakota. There was a Dakota village that came under attack by the Chimokuman. And that's our Ojibwe word for American, long knives. And that reference to long knife is the bayonet at the end of the soldiers' rifles. That's how they were described. And the American soldiers had arrived at this Dakota village to destroy it, to decimate it. They were not there to take prisoners, they were there to destroy the village. And it said that a woman, Wiaka Shintewi, tail feather woman, hid for her life in a pond. Underwater, she used a reed to breathe, a hollow reed to breathe through, and hid for her life because if she were discovered, she would have been killed. Again, they were not there to take prisoners. They were there to destroy the village. While she is hiding for 3 to 4 days, it's said that she received a vision from Wakantanka. The Great Spirit, the Great Mystery told her, I am very disappointed in how human beings are living. Because there's a great deal of war going on in North America. There's the conflict for the Great Plains. The Civil War had just ended. What a horrific massacre that had been. And the Dakota are not just in a conflict with the Americans, they're also in a conflict with the Ojibwe. And when she was instructed to make this drum, she was instructed to make a drum in her vision and to present that drum to the Ojibwe. And Wiakashintewin, tail feather woman, escapes with her life, flees to the nearest village, relates her vision to the holy men there, and they agree with her at once. And they begin creating this drum. And once it's created, along with the implements, the opwaganuk, the chanupa, the pipe, the miigwanuk, the eagle feathers, and the songs, they literally bring the drum to Mississauga, to Lake Mille Lacs, where they present this to the Anishinaabe, who accept it. The Ojibwe accept it. And at that moment, we have a beautiful example of reconciliation and an Indigenous peace treaty. Because when they sit next to each other, they had been at war with each other for maybe 100, maybe 200 winters, 200 years. They had killed each other's relatives. They had brought anxiety, fear, rage, bereavement, poverty, everything terrible war brings with it. And here they sat together. And when they sounded the drum, that word for drum, it literally means de, the heart, we, the sound or voice, and degun, the instrument. When they played the instrument that makes the sound of the heartbeat, that was both of their hearts beating in unison. When they sang, they were singing with the same voice. When they prayed with the sacred pipe, the smoke that came out represented the breath that they both breathed. And at that point, maybe if they didn't have peace in their hearts, what they were doing was giving their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren a chance to live in peace with one another, that they would do that for each other. As a young man, I thought courage would mean I'm unafraid to go and fight Dakotas. And when I heard this story, it transformed my idea of what it means to have a strong heart. It meant I am unafraid to love that one I called an enemy, but who is actually always a relative. I'm unafraid to have reconciliation. I am unafraid to live a life of peace, because if you're at war, you can't have minupumatsuen. You can't have peace. Peace has never come that way. And they must have known, and the spirit must have known, that in order for us to survive the reservation period, to survive boarding schools, colonization, to survive termination, the loss of language and culture, that we would need to work together. And even here in Minneapolis, we have schools where we teach both Dakota and Ojibwe next to each other. I used to work as an immersion teacher, and I worked next door to Dakota speakers. And we worked side by side with one another, helping one another. And we did it because of our ancestors' example, because they had true strength of heart. And if you're living with that sort of strength of heart, you'll have guaiquatizum, virtue, honesty, righteousness. And I wonder if some of you are asking, well, didn't we speak about truth earlier? And aren't truth and honesty, at least in English, kind of synonymous? If you're honest, you tell the truth. If you tell the truth, you're honest. But in Ojibwe, honesty really doesn't have anything to do with what you say. It has everything to do with how you live. And I think everyone here has dealt with an experience where you've had someone in your life who tells you should dress a certain way, you should do a certain ceremony, you should pray a certain way, you should act this way. And then you see them on a Friday or Saturday night doing the complete opposite. Everyone is going to have that experience of contradiction, saying one thing and then doing another. In the language, I think if you're truly honest, it will come out in how you lead your life. So it is not talking the talk, it is walking the walk. And if you genuinely need to know if someone is being honest with you, observe how they live. I'll observe if you are living a straight and correct life. I'll observe if you are living according to these traditional values. There'll be a natural consequence of that, or we will see how you live. Really, this is from the Haudenosaunee speaking people, but I like how these two lines are in alignment. My words are in alignment with my actions. I do what I say. I say what I do. I'm not deceiving you. You'll see it in my actions. And if you are living with Deboywen, with truth, with Dabasen Dizowin, with humility, you do not exalt yourself above your relatives. With Manaji Iddiwin, you go easy on one another. You respect each other. You acknowledge the sanctity in each other's lives. If you have that unconditional, compassionate love for one another, that's Zagit Diwan. If you are totally unafraid to live with a strong heart, you are totally unafraid to lead that good life. You are living a virtuous, a righteous, and an honest lifestyle, then every single thing you do will be good for someone, not just now, but for someone 7 generations from now. Every single thing you do will be done with wisdom, with intelligence. It'll be done for the benefit of someone who has not yet arrived. And we know that they will come. And if I'm able to act with this sort of wisdom, it'll be in a way that's beneficial for them. I'll act with vision. And so, in closing, because I'll take a few minutes, 2 minutes, and then we'll take some questions. In closing, when I began learning the language, every single elder I spoke to, and this is rare in Indian country, this was 100%, every single elder I spoke to said, if you really want to know the culture, the history, the ethics, the philosophy, the spirituality, it's all in the language. It's all in the language. And it took me a while to really realize what they were saying. Here are some examples of people who had hieroglyphs. Earlier, I spoke of a petroglyph, something carved into stone. This is hieroglyphs, sacred writing. Things that were committed to stone and that you can still read today, thousands of years later. Something that people thousands of years ago thought would be important enough for someone in the year 2021 to know. Here's an example of Egyptian hieroglyphics. And the reason I'm showing you this particular cartouche is that until the mid 18th, 19th century, people didn't know what was written down. They didn't even know what language the hieroglyphs were written in. They had recorded these into edifices that you can practically see from outer space. And they had recorded them into stone, but there comes a time where people forget how to write in the hieroglyphs. They forget how to read them, and then they even forget what language they're in. These are in Coptic. The reason I'm showing these, this was a huge breakthrough where they figured out, wait, they're not just making pictures, they're literally writing out their language. Yet all of that knowledge was consigned to silence because people had forgotten how to read the hieroglyphs. Happens here in Mesoamerica as well. The Mayans had such detailed astronomical knowledge that it takes NASA until the late 60s, early 70s to actually catch up with them. They had built huge pyramids in alignment with celestial beings, with the stars, and then they recorded it all. And yet, in a terrible legacy of colonialism, their sacred books were burned. They were considered devil worshippers. And all of this knowledge was lost until they began breaking the Mayan code in like the 1970s and 1980s. And one point I love mentioning here is that I can give you every assurance that the aliens did not come and build these magnificent pyramids. Mayans did this. When they read their language, they understand it. These were their ancestors who created that. Yet all of that knowledge had been lost. When I began learning the language, it took me a while, but then I realized, wait, I am taking place in a 10,000 year investment in us. Every time we use the language, we have an investment in us. And one of the most clever investments I've ever seen is that anything we make, I spoke a lot about things eternal today. Anything that has a beginning has an end. That's the natural law here on earth. But they must have known that any building we create, any sculpture, any painting, will one day turn to dust. So how will I pass these teachings down to someone who we know is coming? And the genius investment was, we will put the teachings in the language itself. So you'll learn how to use the words, but then when you need to really examine, what does it mean to be truthful? How do I be virtuous? How do I love? What does that word really mean? You can look in the language and find it. And so I hope that if you have a chance to work with Indigenous communities who have said that the culture is the language and the language is the culture, that you have a better perspective of that. And I'll take this moment to say, thank you all so much for listening to this. It's been a great privilege and a pleasure. And I genuinely mean it when I say it. Thank you all for listening. So here's my website. You can greet me here, and I'll take a few moments of questions too, if you'd like.
That would be great. Thank you so much. Wow. There were a couple questions that were just popped in the chat. Let's see if anyone wants to unmute and ask one live right now, and then I can ask these if not. So one of the questions was, why do you think Americans have moved away from sacred truths to a relativism? Yeah, that's the question.
Anna, Relativism, I don't know. An observation though, that I find, and I understand that like I do a word of the day and I talk to people and take selfies and stuff, but I spoke earlier about being self-centered and how do things affect me rather than how do my actions affect other people. And I think that we live in a society of instant gratification, and we're looking at how do things affect me right now rather than how are things going to affect my grandchildren or my great grandchildren. I think we've really lost that point of view. Because the moment you realize, oh, I'm affecting someone I'm related to, I think it's intrinsically built into us to care for them. Even if we don't see our great grandchildren yet, I would like to be kind to them. I would like to show them that compassionate love. Yet if you don't have that perspective, if you're focused solely on yourself, it can make it really easy to be destructive to generations that are coming. I think we've seen that with how we treat our energy. I think we're seeing it how we treat our technology, with destruction and disdain and wanting to dominate our surroundings rather than trying to live in harmony with the land and with our relatives. And also losing that perspective that we're related, that how I treat my relatives
Yes.
affects me, rather than
Yes.
how I treat them
Yes.
can be the best for me or how I can get ahead.
And that we're relative to one another, even if we're not blood
Absolutely.
relatives, right? And to the world around us. Yes, absolutely. Are there any other questions? I know that I want to be respectful of your time and your son. I know you need to go get him from school.
I booked this before
Um,
my son went to school, and then he gets out at 2:00. I live like 2 minutes away from school, but when I saw 2:00, I emailed yesterday and said, I'll have to leave a few minutes early. That's the
Yeah.
answer.
Well, we'll close it out without you. Anyone else want to jump in? I'm seeing things like thank you and amazing and wow. And I think it was very moving and poignant. I saw that comparison of different cultures, and the parts that we share. That part was very moving for me to see. And I guess when I read that question about Americans and moving away from the sacred, not all of them have.
There was another question as well.
Oh, good.
Somebody had written, my culture also has this idea of respecting the teachings of elders and culture. How does connecting to your language and culture impact how you live your life?
Yeah. I think for me, learning the language and learning how they described honesty, how they described love, just the change in perspective changed my consciousness. There are other smaller things like mitig and asin. These are two words in Ojibwe that are tree and stone. Now, in the language, these are animate nouns. Our gender is animate and inanimate rather than masculine and feminine. So a tree, I think we'd all accept as a living being. It grows, it can die. In the language, a stone is a grandfather. Somehow I began treating the environment then like I would a relative, because the language I have to use for the stone is the same language I would have to use for you, anyone listening, for my wife, my son, or my parents. And that part really changed it. And yeah, just for me, respect used to be almost like respect authority rather than going easy on someone, rather than showing them compassion. I think we've all seen a probably fake or full humility in our lives rather than really feeling that, wow, I am not more important than you. And when it becomes like my thirst, if we don't have water, and my hunger, if we don't have food, then you really feel it. That's how it began. It made me more empathetic to the teachings, to these sacred laws. That's how it changed it for me.
Well, Again, I want to thank you. I'm going to encourage you to say goodbye.
Great.
I would love to be with you longer, and maybe we'll join each other again sometime, but I want to thank you. This has been very important and meaningful for a number of people, from what I can tell. There is a question, any suggestions for those who are interested in learning more about the language or resources here in Minnesota or elsewhere?
If you can check out the American Indian Center. They offer both courses in songs, in the drum, and in languages, both Dakota and Ojibwe. I think that would be a really great place to start. And those are all free as well. So that would be really excellent.
Wonderful. I'm going to send out a follow-up to everyone. I'll try to put a link to that and also your website. And we'll watch for the final version of the slides there where we can access them.
Miigwech.
Miigwech,
Well,
have a good
We don't
afternoon.
have goodbye in Ojibwe. What we say is Gigawabman, I'll see you later, or Banama Minawa Orasabundaman Gigawabundaman. The spirits will decide when we see each other again. Farewell. Miigwech.
Farewell. Everyone who's still here, I want to say thank you for being here. We will be sending out an evaluation survey, and it's so important if you can give us feedback here. We do share the summary with our presenters, and that's both affirming and educative for them. We also take your suggestions as we develop future ECHO sessions, and so that's important. We want this learning community to reflect your priorities. And so that survey will probably go out a little later this afternoon. You'll have about a week to complete it, and then we'll send out certificates, which is the last question on the survey. If you need a certificate of attendance for continuing education, we will send one to you via email. And I want to just call on Sherry. She's my colleague here at Wayside, and she's helping us. She may be able to give us a little update on what's the next scheduled Indigenous Women Wellness ECHO.
Yeah, so the next Indigenous Women's Wellness ECHO is going to be on Tuesday, February 23rd, and we're going to have Susan Bolio from the University of Minnesota, and she's going to present.
Great. So save the date. We'll send out reminders and invitations, and I hope that you have a wonderful day. And yeah, just have a wonderful day. Let you go. That's it. We're done.
Rebecca, you've got that chat recorded, correct?
I think it does it automatically.
Oh, it does?